Hey everybody, what's good? What's going on? JB here, back with another CyberInsight live stream. Today is something a little bit different than what we've kind of been doing the past few weeks, doing a whole bunch of DevOps and network engineering and cloud stuff. The impetus for today's live stream is actually I have a group of friends that we've been talking about some different types of compliance stuff, and they actually wanted to set up a private meeting where we kind of did like a 101 going over NIST 853, the Security Controls Traceability Matrix that the federal government uses when accrediting systems. And I was all for it. I'm like, hey, let's do it. Let's set this thing up. But then I was like, well, if we're actually going to spend that much time going into it, might be a little bit more beneficial if I throw it up here on YouTube, invite some other folks that can come in, ask questions, and then it's up here in perpetuity. So if you have any NIST 853 hate, you can direct that this way, throw it in the chat. But hopefully there's some information that you're able to take from this, especially because I'm trying to approach it from the perspective of an engineer. Anybody who does any type of GRC or compliance type of work knows that it's not necessarily very much fun. And it's not completely applicable in all different avenues to the work that an engineer does. So we're going to try to look at it, at least from an engineering perspective, and pick out the important stuff that's beneficial to individuals when they go to build out what is hopefully somewhat secure IT environments. So as I mentioned, any questions, throw them in the chat. I am by no means the NIST 853 master, but I've had a decent amount of experience with it, built out a bunch of different systems, being the architect for systems that had to follow those types of guidelines. So I might have a little bit of experience and be able to help answer some questions. So yeah, throw those questions in the chat. Make sure you smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, all that other good stuff, that I mentioned at the beginning. And we can hop over into my browser and we're going to go through a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to try and keep it somewhat high level, but I don't know. As we kind of move through this, if there's some more in-depth questions, we can kind of do that. I think initially we should probably cover what is NIST 853, why it's important, why it's used, a little bit about the different types of protections that it tries to ensure is implemented. We can actually dig into the controls themselves, or at least from a high-level perspective, the controls that I think are applicable from an engineering perspective. And yeah, we'll just kind of go from there. So if you aren't familiar with what it is, or in general, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, National Institute of Standards and Technology has developed a whole bunch of different types of documentation that's used primarily by the government, the federal government, DoD, and a lot of commercial industries rely on the information they provide as well. They put out a lot of useful standards. They get a bunch of smart people together in a room, should knock on some wood, hopefully, and come up with different types of policies, procedures, and I'm trying to think what else I want to kind of throw into there. As I mentioned, standards that individuals and organizations are able to take and try and standardize the different types of security controls that they implement across their organization. So when looking at the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, really there's a whole bunch of different components that they try to make sure that they're able to implement when it comes to protecting an organization, its data, and its people. And that is kind of 5 different areas of cybersecurity: identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering. Now, we don't really need to go too much into detail as far as the actual NIST cybersecurity framework itself, but it's just helpful to know that this kind of marries up with NIST 853, which is a set of controls that is put into a matrix and is broken up into a whole bunch of different types of, well, they call them families, but different areas that we want to ensure that we have the right type of technical controls in place, procedural controls in place, and administrative controls in place. You might have heard some other things with NIST before. So 853 is used when we're talking about federal systems. You also get into 800, 171. That kind of starts to get into for the protecting controlled unclassified information. And that also kind of aligns a little bit more with like DoD stuff. You might have heard of FedRAMP. Again, that's something dealing with security controls for cloud environments that are supporting the federal government. So these things all kind of have a lot of similarities and overlaps between them because they are all being derived out of NIST standards. So I did a diagram a long time ago, and I'm going to pull this up, or I should say an infographic, not necessarily a diagram, trying to break down the NIST 853 Security Controls Traceability Matrix into technical control families that really matter more so to engineers. Now, this is not up to date because this was actually based off of Rev 4. They now have Rev 5 that's been out for a few years, but really depending upon the organization that you're in, you still might be using Rev 4. We're going to get to the differences between those and how you can make sure that you kind of cover those gaps. But generally speaking, there's 18 control families here with Rev 4, and we can kind of go through, generally speaking, what these are, and then we can do a little bit more of a deep dive into the actual tracking spreadsheet that has all of the controls for these. So you have access control. That's really dealing with like logons and sessions. They also cover wireless under that and different types of accounts. Incident response is exactly what you would think that that is. That's definitely more so on the cyber side, responding to different types of incidents within an organization. Although sometimes that bleeds over into other types of responses as well, so different types of emergencies and stuff like that. The program management, that kind of deals with the overall managing of the program, obviously. Pretty straightforward, but kind of your management processes that are in place dealing with the organization and the security practices and things like that. Audit and accountability is another control that I would say kind of aligns a little bit more in the responsibilities for engineers. And that's going to deal with kind of like your event logging, making sure that you're getting, syslogs, you have different types of agents on different things. It's kind of worth pointing out with these that these controls themselves, and you'll see once we go over it, they're kind of very much high level. So if you're familiar with using other types of compliance benchmarks for individual operating systems or different types of devices, those are much more granular controls and tell you how to implement those on specific types of vendors, where this is more so saying you need to be doing this in your environment. Are you collecting syslogs across all your devices? Are you alerting on different types of things? Do you have a way to filter logs to make sure that you get pertinent information out of it? Are you taking those logs and sending them back to a SIM and doing some type of correlation in your environment? So it's a little bit more high level types of controls that the 853 focuses on. What else falls under AU? So audit and log retention, storage for that. I think they also do non-repudiation, so that can also get into maybe some certs and stuff like that. You'll also notice when we start to go through these, every one of these control families has a combination of technical controls and administrative controls. And each of those, actually, when we're looking at these at a top level, will have different policies and procedures that need to be written. So there's policies and procedures that need to be written for every single control family, but then also within each of those control families, we'll often find other types of controls that need to be implemented that might also have some other type of derived documentation that needs to be done with those. Your MA maintenance is really dealing more so with your practices for how you do maintenance within your environment for IT systems. A lot of these might also have different types of overlap with other types of controls, and maybe overlap isn't the right word, but they interact with or have contingencies with other things. So another thing with maintenance is like, do you allow remote management into your systems? If you do, what type of protections do you have in place to make sure that only authorized individuals are able to make changes? When you go to have maintenances, do you have maintenance windows? Is that done through the configuration management practices that you have in place within your organization? So things like that. RA risk assessment ends up aligning a little bit more with InfoSec and GRC types of requirements, but from a engineering perspective, uh, stuff dealing with like vulnerability management and how quickly you patch things and meeting the requirements for remediating or patching or mitigating criticals, highs, mediums, and lows. That's going to fall under the risk assessment stuff. So that's definitely a control family that, even though it might be led a little bit more from the InfoSec side of things, there's going to be a lot of input into those particular controls, especially dealing with vulnerability management, that engineers are responsible for. Awareness and training is exactly what that sounds like. So your awareness and training programs that you have in your organization, what type of security training are you doing, annual refreshers, are you covering things that are required by the government? Something else that's worth kind of mentioning kind of when looking through these is you have the downward requirements that are kind of pushed down overall from the government if you are doing this for the purpose of actually gaining a government accreditation. You could just be using this because it's a good control framework, and you could just be using it in a private company and stuff like that, and you might not actually have any real regulations that you need to meet with that. But you can also then end up adding other types of additional controls in addition to the standard controls that are there. And I'll actually show you once we get into the matrix itself where we can kind of see those and put those in. Media protection, here we're talking about DVDs, CDs. I don't even know if people use CDs anymore. That's but DVDs, thumb drives, protection of data, encryption, things like that, whatever your policies are for allowing removable media and things like that. So again, a little bit more of a InfoSec based control, but you are going to be working with different types of technologies to implement some types of technical controls in your organization. The CA family, security assessments and authorization. So that's really dealing with the controls for the process that you need to have somebody coming in and doing some type of assessments on your system. So whether we're talking about red teams, pen testing, security controls assessments. So that's actually going to be where folks will come in, do a SCA assessment. Although I think the A on there stands for assessment. So that's like kind of like one of those things like CAT card where you don't need to say card at the end of that. But folks come in and they will review your 853 documentation, and they'll make sure that you have all the policies and procedures that you say that you have in place. They'll ask for different types of artifacts based off of the different controls that you have. Again, that's normally going to be something led by the InfoSec team, but has a tie back into being able to provide those artifacts and stuff like that from your engineering and operations team. Configuration management is exactly what that sounds, making sure that you have the policies in place, an overall configuration management program. You have a review board, you have a defined process that you go through for any type of changes in the environment. This is all documented, things like that. Personnel security, that's going to be completely a personnel security or InfoSec related thing. So from an engineering perspective, you aren't necessarily going to be having to deal with that too much, except for the case if there are things that might come out of that that require some type of additional technical controls for, let's say, insider threats, or they need you to be able to pull certain types of information about some type of activity that's going on. But actually the controls for being able to replay traffic and stuff like that actually don't fall under personnel security. I think it ends up falling under the AU control. Let's see, what else did I miss? Something there? No. So we're moving to SC next. And I see a whole bunch of questions in the chat. I will hit those up as soon as I get through this infographic. So SC, System and Communication Protection. This is probably one of my more favorite ones, being from the networking side of stuff. So that's going to deal more with how you are segmenting data flows in your environment, your DNS configurations, boundary protections, firewalls. You can deal with other types of security appliances that you can have there, your cryptography, VoIP, and all that type of good stuff. CP, even though I don't necessarily have it there necessarily as a control family that falls underneath engineering, it really does when you think about it. So you have kind of the planning aspect of all of that, but contingency planning also deals with redundancy and having backups of data, off-site storage or hot site, cold site, warm site type of stuff. So I'm trying to think what else kind of also going along with those. I think like redundant internet circuits, things like that. So there actually is definitely an engineering component to that. But then there's also kind of the administrative, what is our actual disaster recovery plans? What's our contingency plans? Do we have a test? How often do we do these types of tests? Things like that. PE, physical environmental protection, that's pretty much making sure that you have alarm systems, the right types of locks, right types of emergency or ability to call emergency contact type of stuff. Or not emergency contact, but emergency services. Again, not really necessarily something that aligns with the engineering side of stuff. SI, system and information integrity. There we're dealing with antivirus types of protection, email spam, patching practices, making sure that we are actually patching things, integrity and validation type of stuff. I'm trying to remember, the software development lifecycle also falls under here, but that might actually be under SA, I think. IA, identification and authentication. Here we're talking about AAA, right? So, but more so the, I want to say the authorization part of that, because we also already covered kind of like the access control part back in the AC family. But again, like I said, there's a bit of overlap with all of that. So identifiers and so identifiers being like user accounts, service accounts, authenticators. So that could be passwords, that could be PIVs, that could be other types of MFA authenticators, the management of that. And then doing this both not only from a user perspective, but from a device perspective as well. So that's definitely a very heavy engineering control family. Then we have planning. And the last one that I mentioned was the SA, systems and service acquisition. I believe that is where like the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, kind of falls into that. There's also some other things with purchasing hardware, software, I think falls into that. And there's something else that I wanted to hit on that I just don't remember. Mobile code is in that as well under the software side of stuff. So this was 18 control families for Rev 4. Rev 5 actually has 2 new control families. And we can hit that up in just a little bit, but let me go and see what we got for questions coming in here. I'm going to throw some stuff up here. What's going on? Appreciate everybody dropping in. Professor Black Ops, what's good? Fed for life. Yep. Rev, what's good? What are the 3 impact levels in regards to what? Are you talking about like within the controls themselves? So like the low, moderate, and high. And a lot of those actually get tied back to other types of, I think how I want to put this. So I was mentioning kind of like the STIG controls or other types of baseline controls. There's kind of like this overarching mapping of kind of like this DoD stuff to the federal government stuff. And we do kind of get into, on the DoD side, it's Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3, kind of have that here. And then you get into kind of from an accreditation perspective, what is the, what's the word I want to use? Not leniency, but what's the appetite of the organization to accept certain things? I mean, normally anything that has like a high is not supposed to be accepted. Same thing with Cat 1. I mean, obviously there can be mitigating circumstances, and you can always put in POAMs for different things, and depending upon how important things are, they may or may not be approved. But as far as the actual language, as far as like the impact of those different levels, I don't know that off the top of my head. I would have to go Google that. So which controls align with CMMC and FedRAMP? That is a fantastic question, and we could Google that. I don't know. I actually haven't had to do any of the CMMC or FedRAMP stuff. I just know that since it's all derived kind of out of the similar NIST controls, it is a very, very large overlap. So I think having a background in any one of those, probably you're going to find an awful lot of similarities between them. Now, let's see. There's Jay. What's up, man? As an engineer, what was the most effective way for you to be sure that all applicable controls were implemented? So normally what ends up happening with these, at least from accreditation standpoint, is somebody has to come out. You have the assessors come out and they have to certify this, and you're going to end up with a whole bunch of people all in a room going through these things and being provided different types of artifacts for things. And this is where like having a good relationship with whatever the authority is that's doing the accreditation comes in really good, especially if you're on top of your shit. Then you can really articulate, especially why certain controls, what you end up having implemented might not be word for word exactly what they want, but you're coming back to the intent of the control. And if you can demonstrate that what you're doing is as good or better, then normally that goes over really well. There are some types of ways to pull some of this information for the technical controls from different types of scanning and stuff like that. So for instance, with Tenable or ACAS, they actually have 853 dashboards. Honestly, I haven't found too much use in those just because they're only as good as the check that it's using to look for whatever it's looking. And so if you have some type of deviation from specifically what it's looking for, even though you are meeting whatever the control is, I don't know. And then you got to take that data and find some way to end up putting that into another type of format and feeding it all back. So, you know, for some stuff, it makes sense. You have baselines that you have that are meeting the requirements. I like to kind of look at it from the perspective of a lot of these, you're using different types of security baselines, like I said, STIGs or CIS benchmarks and stuff like that. If you have some type of monitoring to make sure whenever there's any type of changes in the environment, so changes to configs, changes to GPOs and stuff like that, as long as you have kind of like that baseline set that, hey, we are meeting these things because we have our configurations implemented like that, like this, how we said it is, then that's kind of like a good starting point. But it is something that's continuous, right? So it's not necessarily like you do this once and then you don't have to think about it again. You're in a constant state of assessment and validation. And I mean, that's even why they've moved from having kind of like, I don't know what it would be, an assessment every 2 years or something like that, to kind of this whole continuous monitoring, which requires a lot more people to be on teams specifically supporting GRC to collect all this information and do monthly and quarterly reporting on all of these things. So it's quite a heavy lift. So there's actually quite a good bag in this career field if you're kind of into these types of things. The only thing is, honestly, it's pretty boring. So if you don't mind it being boring and you kind of just stay on top of what the controls are and you implement some automation to be able to pull this type of data into reporting and stuff like that, then hey, you will have a very, very long career doing that. Let's see. Anything? Oh, Chris. Yeah, thanks, Chris, for responding. So at the high end, 853 and 8171, which I think I mentioned that on the other webpage. If you know all the NIST controls, it translates over to the CMMC. Exactly. It's all derived from NIST. Let's see. Professor Black Ops, are you discussing in-device implementation hardening that rolls back up to NIST? Yeah. So that ends up falling under some different types of specific controls. I'm trying to remember which family it is. It might be under CM, but specifically stating that you are using some type of hardening guidelines and you do have a security baseline. Oftentimes, it's up to the organization itself to determine those. Obviously, if you're in DoD, then they're determining you're going to use STIGs. And if you're in the federal government, sometimes there's a little bit more leeway with that between STIG or CIS. And if you're just a commercial company, then you can kind of make up whatever you want to do because you're just using this because it's a relatively solid documented control matrix. But really, you could do whatever you want to do. Unless there's regulations which are determining what, so like, PCI compliance or something like that. Well, let's see if there's anything else in here. Let's see, one more from Jay. If you've assessed the implemented controls, did you layer the techniques such as examining, interviewing, and testing? I'm trying to understand what you're asking there. If you've assessed the implemented controls, do you layer the techniques such as examining, interviewing, and testing? I mean, yeah, so let me try and answer that. So normally it's done all in one assessment activity. So they will ask for a bunch of artifacts ahead of time before they come out for a security controls assessment. Sometimes this also coincides with having a pen test or red team come out as well. So it's kind of like a very big data dump of information, both from the technical side and from the administrative side. So you give them some stuff ahead of time, they come out, hopefully they've reviewed the stuff ahead of time. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And then you pretty much hand in hand walk through the entire SCTM, which is, I don't know how many controls it is, 900, 1,000, something like that. Line by line. Normally what ends up happening is you have different assessors are assigned to different control families, and you can have a couple folks from the technical side or from the InfoSec side that are able to answer questions and kind of just plow through that. All right, let's see. Let me move over and we can take a look at a few different things here. So first off, this is what 853 Rev 5 looks like. This is a ridiculous PDF that you will pretty much never want to read like this. So it is what it is. But the way that it's broken down, you can see that it has a high level control, AC17. It tells you what the control is. It tells you what the discussion is as far as what you need to do and why you're doing it. And then it has control enhancements. So enhancements was the word that I was looking for as far as additional controls that you need to implement. And these can vary depending upon the organization itself. If you have additional security guidelines that they're making you meet, depending on classification of the system. So it really can vary. But you do want to make sure that you are paying attention to the control enhancements. You don't want to just be like, oh yeah, I knocked this out, and then not pay attention to the control enhancements. As I mentioned, there's a lot of overlap and kind of interplay between different controls. And you can see here that they have, all these other related controls. Does this really matter to you too much? Maybe, maybe not. The good thing to know, at least when you're doing this, because you have to write out responses for each of these controls, is you might end up writing out something that ends up holistically speaking to a whole bunch of different controls. So if you do that, then you can then take that response and copy and paste it in with other controls that you need to have a response for. But yeah, we're not gonna flip through this. I just want to show you that it is in PDF form. You can do that. almost 500 pages. Definitely not worth it. So what we do end up using is Excel spreadsheets, right? Awesome Excel spreadsheets. And this is the page where you can go to actually pull down either that PDF or you can pull down the spreadsheets themselves. And we can actually go ahead and pull that up so you can kind of see what this looks like. And I actually modified the spreadsheet a bit because there's just a few little things that I find to be more beneficial. And let me pop this up on the screen. And I know that that's really small, but once I kind of hit the high level stuff, then I can zoom in on some other stuff for you. So the way that when you get this from the NIST website, you're going to have control identifier. You're going to have control or enhancement name, the text and discussion, and related controls. The stuff that I like and that I added was a responsible column here. And I find that to be useful, especially when you're working on this as a team and you're kind of working through it as an iterative document, being able to be like, hey, yeah, this needs to go to this team, this needs to go to this person. Or even if it's something, I know that they've kind of tried to get away from labeling responsibility and looking at things holistically. And that's fine, especially when you're actually submitting this finally back to the organization that's doing the accreditation. But I think if you can identify which group, or specifically if it's some type of inheritance of security ownership, right? So maybe you're doing some type of third-party service, right? And you're relying on somebody else who has their own practices put in place, or you're using a cloud environment, and that's going to be like FedRAMP controlled stuff. And the CSP is the one that's responsible for, the underlying infrastructure and things like that. Just identifying it as you're going through your working copy here kind of will help make things make a little bit more sense as far as what you need to make sure that you're taking account for. The other thing that they don't have that I find to be really helpful and useful is having categories for how a control is implemented. And normally this can also be dictated by the organization doing the accreditation. But so if the control is implemented, put a check here, and then over in this response column, you write up why. If you haven't done it yet, but you're planned on doing it, you put a check there and put whatever your POAM is, right? Compensatory or compensated and tailored, kind of a little bit different. So if you're kind of meeting the control in some way, or you're using some other type of control to end up meeting the intent, then you can end up using the compensated. Tailored might be if something isn't all the way applicable, but still has some applicability, then you might tailor the response for the control in a way due to not needing to meet all of those particular controls, because maybe technically whatever they're trying to protect, you don't have that in your environment, or you only have part of it. And then my favorite control when going through this is not applicable. Those are glorious. Whenever you have anything that's not applicable, then hey, you put as not applicable and you're like, hey, we don't have wireless in this program. Boom, done. And then all the different controls for wireless, boom, gray out. Don't need to deal with it. All right, hold on one second. I'm going to get a drink of water. I'm going like Marco Rubio over here and getting a little parched. So let's see. So let's talk about the not applicable, the response. You can also have another column that might make sense as far as what the approving authority might have a response back to stuff. Because like I said, this is kind of a continual thing. This isn't necessarily you get it once and then you're done. You might implement something, they might have a comment on it. There might be some back and forth as far as getting things hashed out. So that might be something that is worth doing. Maybe you don't put it this way. You probably have some type of POAM documentation that maybe that would fall under. So just depends on the organization, how they like to do it. I would completely get rid of this related controls column in here. That does me not too much good, especially as a final product going back to improving authority. The other thing that I like to do that they don't have it broken down this way is for each of the high-level controls, have its own horizontal column for that, or line, with the control identifier and the name. It just makes it much easier as you're flipping through stuff to be able to see what you're actually looking under and what it falls under. So, you know, all the stuff under account management, all the AC2s would all be under that. And then once we get down to AC3, we'd have another line across that says AC3, access enforcement, and then all the other additional enhancements and stuff like that underneath. So I find that to be useful. Another thing that is pretty helpful when trying to manage these is actually, instead of having it just be this whole spreadsheet with, how many lines was it? I went too far down. A 1,000 controls, right? 1,100, 1,200, whatever it is. Break out tabs on the spreadsheet for the individual control families. That just makes it easier to exactly go where you need to go. It makes it easier as far as when you're having different groups working on different controls within different control families versus having to kind of like flip through this whole thing. You could use, like, they have the filter ability and stuff like that, but I just think it's a little bit cleaner when you have all the different tabs to be able to move into stuff. Let's see. Let's talk about Rev 5 real quick, and then we can kind of dig into these a little bit more to give you a bit of an idea of what the data within these actually looks like. So let me switch back over to my browser. Let's see. Okay. So I mentioned this is where you can get all the stuff for Rev 5. If you actually go and get 853A, this is actually kind of like a similar thing as far as the spreadsheet, but it's actually what's used when they're assessing, unless the assessing organization kind of like developed its own spreadsheet. But they could be using this. This actually lays out a little bit more of a thing as far as what types of things for them to be asking for and what types of tests to do. Although normally there's a lot of work that goes into actually determining what those specific artifacts are. So it might say, like, you know, for this control, ask for artifact, but still the assessment team needs to be smart enough to figure out, like, okay, for this type of control, what's really a valid artifact to ask for? And also doing it in a way where it's not just them asking for the same stuff over and over and over again. There's ways you can be smart about asking for particular things that end up knocking out a whole bunch of different artifacts for controls. Let's see. So we already went over those. Let's look at 853 versus Rev 4 versus Rev 5. Oh, and everything that we're covering in here, I put links for this all in the video description, so you can go and dig into this and kind of see what these all entail. So Rev 4 came out in 2013. Rev 5, I'm trying to remember when that came out. It wasn't that long ago, a couple of years ago, I think. But the things that it did add, it added 2 new control families. It added the supply chain risk management, which makes an awful lot of sense based off of the SolarWinds stuff. And then the other control family that it added, the PII, processing and transparency. So I think that there was some PII like an addendum isn't the right word. There were some additional PII controls that kind of were like an appendix or something like that, that kind of could get overlaid, but now they actually created its own control family and have those all laid out there specifically. All right, let's see. I got some other questions coming in. Let me throw these up. How do orgs pass this when there's essentially no organizational plan that can meet half of them? Well, that's when it comes back to intent of controls and tailoring things. And I mean, so I've been lucky that on the stuff that I've worked on, all of them have all passed. Have passed all their SCA assessments and stuff like that. It definitely is a heavy lift. And it really just depends upon like what the scope of things are. I definitely agree. It's a lot harder when you're talking about, so like all the stuff that I normally have been working on has been all as a service provider. So like developing different types of systems that reside in the cloud and different people go and use those services. Obviously the scope of that and the controls that you need to implement on that are a bit smaller than what you would do in like a organization that has 60,000 people and you're dealing with, BYOD and wireless and things like that. But I think it's like I said, just trying to get an understanding of what you have. And if you don't have the controls in place, as long as it's not, a high level one, you pretty much can write poems to get through and be moving towards an end goal with that. And obviously, depending on the organization itself, they're probably not going to shut it down. I mean, maybe they would, but I think that before something got shut down, they would put an awful lot of resources towards trying to get something knocked out. Let's see. IT, audit, compliance, and assurance are the hidden bag. Yeah, for sure. I mean, because they never end. It's like the post office, and the mail just keeps coming. Um, and then Professor Black Ops is saying he's passed some of his audits. Yeah, I mean, so we can talk about that. I mean, I can share some more personal information, or my not personal information, but personal experience offline as far as kind of what my experience has been with those. But it's more painful the first time, just because you're trying to get your arms around it. But if you actually have a pretty decent infosec team and you kind of get all the engineers like on board with why you're implementing certain types of controls, it's not that bad. Okay, let's see. So we were looking at the differences here. So 45 new base controls, 150 new control extensions, and then 100 new parameters towards existing controls. Now, we're looking at this kind of like from the high level perspective here. So like I mentioned, integrating a supply chain risk management control family. And then some other things, making controls outcome based. So not so much who is doing it, but more so what is the outcome of actually implementing the control. And again, that doesn't have to necessarily be the organization. That could be relying on a third party or something like that. They did some consolidation. I mentioned the PII stuff. Now, if we want to actually see kind of the differences here, they have a whole bunch of different documents where it looks at comparing the two, going between Rev 4 and Rev 5. They actually also, if I move back over to my Excel, let's see. Let's go. So this is the spreadsheet that you can get from that NIST website. where they kind of break down everything. They use some color coding as far as, you know, what was actually changed, modified, added, removed. And then you can kind of go down and see what the actual changes were. So if you actually already are using Rev 4, then you really would want to end up, well, I should say you're using Rev 4 and you're being forced to go and use Rev 5. You would want to understand what that differences is between the Rev 4 and the Rev 5. Actually, I think I had something here. Yeah. Okay. As far as kind of like the way that you'd want to transition that, right? So you'd want your Rev 4 documentation. You'd want to get the documentation showing the differences. You'd want to start identifying the things in Rev 5 that need to be done, but you want to find the stuff that's not applicable. You want to identify the controls that have changed that don't affect your organization, and then eliminate the stuff from Rev 4 that's not in Rev 5 anymore, and that should cut out, you know, a decent amount, and then give you a better starting point. And then identify with what's left, what were the changes that actually had real changes and weren't just something where like the description changed, but the control itself and the intent and what you have implemented didn't change. And so you really don't need to do anything with that. And then whatever you're left with is kind of what you actually need to look at trying to go ahead and implement. So, I mean, they mentioned here, use a team of experts. Yeah, it's definitely something where you're going to want a group of folks. When I first had to start doing this, it pretty much was myself handling all the technical controls, and that kind of sucked, especially going through that the first time. Took a long time to draft documents. I mean, so we're talking like policies, procedures, and then like I mentioned, within each of those control families, there's other controls that you have to actually document in certain cases what a procedure is. So for instance, like what is your procedure for changing authenticators for user accounts? What's your procedure for certificates, right? What's your policy for certificates? Like how often do you need to change the certificates in your organization? Does it matter if it is like a public facing cert or private facing cert? Do you allow self-signed certificates in your environment? Things like that, where you have to actually put some thought into it, draft up a policy and things like that. But once you go through and do that, the heavy lift is done. And then you're just kind of, you know, adding on little bits in here and there as stuff changes. Okay. So I think that was pretty much what I wanted to hit on the different websites. We can go back to the Excel spreadsheet. Let's see the other one. Let's get rid of that. Okay, and let me blow this up a little bit and we can kind of look through just to give you an idea of kind of like what falls into these. So account management, the first control out of all of these control families is a policies and procedure one. It's the same exact control all the way. You will notice that a lot of these have kind of these brackets with organizational defined whatever. And that's going to be something that either you have to determine yourself or the approval authority is going to tell you, you know, what those specific things are. If you can define it yourself, then you can do it so it kind of makes sense specifically, and it's a lot easier to do that than if you have controls that are being forced down on you. So like I said, every single control family starts off with a -1, which is policies and procedures. And then we get into some other things here. So account management stuff, you're going to have the high level one and then the enhancements underneath those. So that's normally going to be like a number, and then you get into the stuff that's in the parentheses. And yeah, it seems like a lot of stuff, but if you actually like read through what it is, define and document types of accounts that are allowed and specifically prohibited within your system, right? So like no guest accounts, vendor accounts are temporary, you have user accounts, you have admin accounts, you have service accounts. Okay. I mean, you can obviously define more accounts than that, but just to kind of give you an idea. Who handles creating the accounts, determining what groups and role memberships different types of accounts go into. So in that case, you're actually going to have to generate kind of like a roles and responsibility matrix and determine, network admins should have or be a member of these groups that have these policies. Again, that is a pain in the ass, but once you have it done, it's pretty easy to kind of continue to push that out throughout the organization. And it actually becomes even more important once you get to the point of, people like to throw out zero trust and things like that. But if you're doing zero trust and you're basing that off of group membership, specifically in LDAP or Active Directory, then yeah, you need to make sure that you have all that stuff tightened up. Privileges, approvals that need to happen. Create, enable, modify, disable, remove accounts, monitoring of accounts, notifying when accounts are no longer needed, when users terminated, authorized to access the system, whole bunch of different stuff like that. And then, like I said, they have enhancements underneath stuff. So support the management system accounts using some type of automated mechanism. What could that be? That could be ticketing. That could be the fact that you're using Active Directory. It could be a bunch of different things. So you can read kind of like the discussion to find out kind of the background and understand the intent of what they have for these individual controls, and then kind of write up your response for that. So auditing temporary emergency accounts, disabling accounts, inactivity login, privileged user accounts, making sure you're monitoring them, revoking when it's no longer needed. And all this stuff that you're kind of like doing through here, a lot of these you're already writing it because you should have kind of like the procedure that does this. So once you write it once, you can use it either in the control response or in the procedure document that you should have. And even if you don't have a procedure document yet and you don't have the control done, maybe you just have like workflows already identified and established in your organization. You probably have SOPs. That works. You got the data right there. Account management, access enforcement. I'm not really going to go all the way through these, but just wanted to kind of hit on some of the stuff under this, particularly the engineering ones. Remote access is a big one. Monitoring for unauthorized connections. Information flow, enforcement. Some of those are actually technical controls that you would implement. Some of them are kind of just technical controls that are already implemented in modern day operating systems. It really depends. A good thing with that, especially if you don't understand what stuff is, there's a glossary on the NIST website that you can go and search for different things that might help provide a little bit of information. Oftentimes this stuff can be a little bit confusing if you're just reading it here and you aren't getting any additional context behind it. Separation of duties, least privilege. Yeah, so if you've taken your CISP, as you kind of like work through all of these different control families, you're going to be like, yep, I know about that, I know about that, I know about that. Unsuccessful logon attempts. So like, does it pop up a warning saying that there's been unsuccessful login attempts? Can you use a alternative authentication factor if your password doesn't work? Who doesn't love a good logon banner? System use notification, previous logon notification, all good stuff. I think they get into some wireless stuff there, but yeah, well, that's good enough for AC. The rest of that is all wireless stuff. AT, we already talked about that, was a training. Role-based training, user awareness. training feedback. Some of these control families are actually pretty small. So like AT is not that big of a lift to go through and at least document what the control responses are. If you don't have a training program and you aren't doing those things, then yeah, that might be a little bit more of a heavy lift. AU, here we're kind of getting into, again, remember I said the first control in all of those different families is policies and procedures. Here we're talking about event logging. For the most part, you're going to hit almost all of these based off of your operating system's event logging. There is additional types of auditing that you are going to need to turn on, within GPOs or maybe within Linux and stuff like that. But a good amount of stuff will already be covered by default. The other configs or other controls later on is actually talking about what you're actually doing with that, what you're alerting on, whether you're pushing it back to a SIM. Are you correlating things? Content of audit records, like if you're using syslog or Windows event logs, then you're pretty much meeting this control. Event logging, audit storage capacity. So this comes back to like both on the device itself. Again, like it really depends. It's kind of funny. An organization might be like, okay, yeah, you need to have, alert whenever the capacity goes above 90% utilized. But that might be like on the individual, like let's say a server, for instance, or a network device, which just overwrites. And so if you're actually offloading those logs someplace else, then you can write this control here to be like, yeah, while the logs on the device itself overwrite, we're actually sending the logs off box to, some type of log collection server, which then resides there and then gets pushed to archive, at a later date or something like that. So, again, it's more about the intent of the control sometimes instead of following the control word for word. And sometimes you end up bumping up against control assessors who might need a little help in understanding your vision for what it is that you're implementing within your organization to meet the controls. Response to audit logging process failures, right? So what happens if it stops logging? Do you have alerts when logging agents go down? Things like that. Review, analysis, and reporting of different types of logging events. Timestamps, right? You should be using like UTC or whatever within your environment, and it should be set all the way across all the systems. Otherwise, your logs are going to be a mess. So, stuff like that. CA, control assessments. Like I said, we don't really do that, although we support that. So, independent assessors within the organization. Information exchange, POAMs, authorization activities, continuous monitoring, all that good stuff. We're talking about continuous monitoring and the fact of what that actually entails. This is making sure that you actually are doing that. Penetration testing, conduct it at a organizational defined frequency. So again, if you can determine that yourself, great. If it's a higher level organization pushing that down, then you kind of just have to meet whatever that is. Red team exercises, pen testing, all that good stuff. Configuration management, having baseline configurations, reviewing those, looking for unauthorized software, having a test and development environment. This is a great control if your organization isn't spending money on having a test and development environment, and they don't want to have one, but you be like, well, NIST 853 CM2 Enhancement 6 says that we need one, so pony up the cash for it, and let's get something going. Configuration change control, having the processes in place for that, testing, validation, notifications, impact analysis of changes, configuration settings, yeah, all sorts of good stuff there. Software restrictions, Then CP, the continuity planning or contingency planning. Again, this kind of is an engineering thing. Do you have a plan? Do you test it? Who do you coordinate with? What type of testing do you do? What are the objectives? Are you meeting the objectives? What do you do if you fail? Capacity planning is an important part as well, like looking at what your systems are actually capable of handling. If usage is going up, what are you actually doing to do capacity planning? Contingency plan testing. Do you have a backup site, an alternative site? Identifying critical assets. Training for your testing, right? So you actually want to make sure that you have individual, whether you start with a tabletop exercise, which is like the least amount of impact, determining other types of event testing that you might want to do. Cloud shared responsibility makes NIST a little easier because the cloud vendors cover a lot. That's a very good point. Yeah, you get a lot of the redundancy and resiliency within those cloud environments that otherwise would be pretty expensive to end up having to have your own other data center and having the circuits to be able to go between those, backhaul links, stuff like that. Yep. Telecommunication services, this is dealing with like primary and secondary links. So not having a single point of failure. Ideally having multiple ISPs for your internet connections. Might be a good thing. System backups. Are you testing those? What are your testing processes? Do you have SOPs written for how to recover system backups? All that type of stuff. IA. Identification and authentication. How are you going about identifying and authenticating folks? Again, like I said, there's some overlap there with the AC controls. So since it all kind of deals with AAA, whatever you have written up there might be applicable for what you put in here, depending on the particular control. Multi-factor authentication, remote access, local access, different types of group authentication, different types of protection for being replay resistant, device identification and authentication. This also is good depending upon like what your individual what's the word I want to use? Like, so if you're using STIGs or CIS, so for instance with STIGs, device authentication, as long as the device resides within a data center, you actually don't need to do device authentication. So all of the different types of communications happening within a rack, within a data center, you don't necessarily need to do that. When you're talking about user PCs and laptops and stuff like that, then yes, you should have some type of network access control that's looking at, you know, certificates on the device or user certificates to make sure that you are authenticating properly. So like I said, depending if you're using STIGs and you know that that's what the control is, then for the response can be like, yeah, we are following the STIG controls for this. This is how we have implemented because of this and this. These other types of configurations aren't necessarily applicable. So you can kind of go at it that way. Identifier management. So again, that's like user accounts. How you go about passing out authenticators. Hopefully, if you're doing like passwords over the phone, then the person has to change it right away. Password-based authentication, PKI-based authentication in person, all that other good stuff. PIV cards. Let's see. Got some other comments coming in. So for MSSPs, is that what they need to implement? When you say that, what do you mean that? I'll just keep going, but when you throw the response up there, I'll answer that. IR, so we talked about incident response, training, simulating events, automated testing, continuous improvement, incident handling, insider threats. Again, like I said, this is definitely falling more on the IR side of things, not necessarily the engineer side of things, but there are some things working back and forth here where there will need to be some types of coordination. The controls for ISPs. So so ISPs only need to follow these rules if the system that they have is being used for federal systems or DoD systems, and they're being accredited by the government. And then as far as the remote access part of that, yeah, and I think Professor Black Ops is kind of answering that. So it really depends. Like if the system is owned by a MSSP or an ISP and is built for the purpose of providing service to the government, then it needs to go through an accreditation process. And then it kind of used to be a little bit, I don't know, hairy, I guess, as far as like stuff not necessarily being standardized. And then that kind of, you can kind of see like that's why they ended up doing FedRAMP, right? Because you have these controls that you're trying to implement across the federal government, which is hard enough to do in general, especially because you're talking about the budgets of these organizations differ tremendously, right? You have an organization like, let's pick something big, NASA or the VA, which has huge budgets and have, you know, a very, very large IT staffs. Then you have other organizations that might be smaller and don't necessarily have that. So something like Social Security Administration, right? So there's a very, very big variance there. That's also why they kind of got to the point of having other services that the organizations need to go through. So for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with the federal government's requirement, the TIC initiative, Trusted Internet Connection. So that's something where pretty much anything going to the internet needs to go, or pretty much anything going to the internet from a federal government organization needs to go through a trusted internet connection. Now, this could be something that the organization itself builds, but then that has to be accredited by the government, or they're able to leverage TICs that are built by different service providers. But then at that point, those systems still need to go through some type of accreditation activity as well. Let's see, anything else here with IR, SOC, operations, incident response plan, spillage, all good stuff. MA was the maintenance stuff. Remember I was talking about controlled maintenance, what tools are you allowed to use for maintenance, monitoring tools for privilege, non-local maintenance. So like, can you do maintenance without actually being in the data center or at the work environment? Can you do it remotely? Are you allowed to? If you are, what's the procedure for that? How does that tie back into your CM processes, things like that? Again, not necessarily always engineer-based, but the engineer is the one doing this. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth and feedback with the CM folks to kind of come up with whatever the approved plan is to be able to do remote management and maintenance, because pretty much everybody does that as long as it's not a classified system. So security clearances for classified systems. Foreign nationals operating on systems that fall under this. Timely maintenance, yeah, okay. Media protection, we talked about media storage, transport, how do you transport data, how do you sanitize data, destruction, reporting, downgrading, how do you handle classified information. PE was the physical stuff, so physical access to the data center or to your building or whatever. So like escorts, 2 forms of ID, having badges, having guards, the type of locks that you have, tamper protection, type of alarms do you have, surveillance stuff. Do you do pen testing on your facility, like physical pen testing, visitor maintenance law or visitor access logs, all that type of stuff. Power and cabling, do you have redundant power? Do you have redundant cooling? Oh, fire protection, a lot of stuff that actually very, very heavy lift. But again, as Professor Black Ops was saying, if you're putting your stuff in the cloud, all this PE stuff, you don't need to deal with that anymore. That's done. I mean, you do obviously for like, your local building and stuff like that. But as far as actually having a data center that you're, making sure that you have to have all the redundant stuff, that's not a thing. PL, talked about that. System security and privacy plans. So your SSP, I believe, is what falls under this. Kind of your overarching document of the security of your organization and the stuff that you have, written out, kind of high level. Probably references a lot of the other documents that you've already written in here. POAMs, identifying leadership roles, enterprise architecture, risk management strategy, insider threat program, threat awareness program. Again, this is something that ties back to like that AT control family where we were talking about the awareness and training. Let's see. A lot of stuff under this PM stuff. PS, personnel security. I don't really need to go too much into that. Just agreements, NDAs, security clearances. This PT one is the one dealing with the PII, the identifiable information. So data tagging, automation, consent. How are you handling consent of capturing PII? Privacy notices. System of records. Probably need to have a PII assessment done on any system that's actually capturing PII. And that should be done by whatever the organization is that's handling all that, I believe. Risk assessments. Let's see. Again, a little bit different than the red team stuff. But remember, RA was what I said. It has all of the Nessus vulnerability scanning, all that stuff is all under RA5. So definitely a lot of stuff in regards to that and engineering. We are almost to the end. We're almost there. So just want to make sure I hit everything, at least from a high level. SA. Yep, SA was where I was talking about the system development lifecycle. So if you don't have an SDLC, get one. But, whatever your SDLC is, document it. Dealing with, making sure you have a pre-production environment for testing. Are you using live or operational data? What's your acquisition process when you're going and buying different software, stuff like that? Supply chain protection, which is interesting. Oh, and it's good that they mentioned that because they have the new supply chain family. So they actually took this out and incorporated it with that new family. It's your acquisition process. Again, I think that there's probably a lot of overlap here with the supply chain family. Is it NIAP approved protection profiles? Again, depends on the organization and what their limit is as far as, if you have to use those or not. Let's see. Documentation. All the supply chain stuff has been removed, so we can just get out of that. Security and privacy engineering principles. And we can just flip through all this. I think a lot of those might be actually somewhat new. We're almost through SA. If you got any other questions while I'm kind of flipping through this, you can go ahead and throw those in the chat too, because I think we're probably going to be wrapping this up pretty soon. So as I mentioned, the SC, one of my favorite control families. This is the one that deals with like data flow isolation. So this is definitely more so on like the networking side, access control flows, only allowing things to have access to what they need to have access to, networking boundaries, software boundaries, cryptography, denial of service protection. Again, so you're definitely hitting like IDPs and stuff like that. Boundary protection, that's going to be like your firewalls, external routers. Again, that does get a little bit iffy kind of like with the cloud stuff. So you probably need to talk a little bit about that and how that's leveraged, and FedRAMP and all that good stuff. More boundary protection, telecommunication services, deny by default, fantastic. Split tunneling, and how you go about making sure that doesn't happen. Although some places maybe it does need to happen, and then you have to end up doing some type of tailoring or something like that to allow for specific reasons. But how do you make sure that that only happens in specific reasons? Host-based protection, network privileged access, discovery of system components. How do you know when new devices are popping up on your environment? More boundary protection, separate subnets for different security domains. Transmission confidentiality and integrity. Type of cryptographic mechanisms are you using to do that? Yep. All good stuff. Mobile code. I thought that was under SA. Maybe it is under SC, but I mean, I understand why they block it. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff that could potentially happen with that, and you aren't able to see the rest of the traffic. So if you're trying to get like an idea, especially if there's like, if your box is popped, right, and there's some type of C2 traffic or something like that, you're going to completely bypass whatever monitoring mechanisms that the organization has. So, protection of information at rest. I think that's good. Wireless protection. Now we're into SI, almost done. Flaw remediation. How do you remediate flaws? Normally that's going to be patching whatever stuff you have, unless you actually are writing your own software. Patch management tools. How often are you patching? Malicious code protection. What do you have to actually protect against that? Are you doing that at the firewall? Do you have a different type of appliance? Are you doing that on endpoints? Hopefully all of the above. Malicious code protection. And some other things there. Automatic updates. Is it centrally managed? Are you testing the updates going there? System monitoring. Well, let's see. Security alerts, advisors, directories. How are you getting information about threats going on to your organization or across the industry? Although depending on how often you're doing your vulnerability scanning, I mean, if you're doing weekly vulnerability scanning, you're going to be picking up stuff quite a bit. Let's see if there's anything else that I kind of want to hit on there. Input validation. That actually matters a lot when you're developing different applications. I think we're almost to the end. So this was SR, so the supply chain risk management. We can call this the SolarWinds control family. How are you going about identifying, tracking, acquisition strategies, tools? What type of reviews are you doing organizationally as far as who you're buying stuff from? Component authenticity. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff there. So this one could be one that's a little bit harder to implement for sure. And since it's kind of new, I think you probably wouldn't be implementing all of it, and would have to do some poems on it. But all right, so I think that about wraps all of that up. Let me see. Let me just go back here. Yeah. So Appreciate everybody dropping in. Had a lot of good questions, a lot of good conversation. Hopefully this was useful in some way, gives you a little bit of a better understanding of 853, especially from an engineering perspective. As I mentioned, everything that we covered, I put a link in the description, so you can go dig through all that. And if you have any other questions later on as you're watching the video, then you can just throw them in the comments section, and I'll try to answer those as best I can. So appreciate you, Professor Black Ops. Thanks for dropping in and checking out the stream. Again, make sure you smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, all that good stuff. If you're interested in any AWS stuff, I just did a really good intro to AWS networking, and also did that from a networking engineering perspective. So if you are on the networking side of stuff and you haven't quite wrapped your head around how networking in the cloud works, I definitely haven't gotten there all the way yet, but it's starting to make a little bit more sense. So definitely go check out that video. And then next week, we're going to be picking back up with my BGP, Cisco BGP lab series. So we're going to do some more stuff with that. And yeah, go check out my CCSP video too. So I passed the Certified Cloud Security Professional exam. So it's like the cloud version of the CISSP. Passed that like a week or two ago. So I had a video reviewing kind of my thoughts on all of that and the different resources I use and stuff like that. So if that's something that interests you, go check that out too. So if nobody else has anything else, we can go ahead and wrap everything up. Appreciate everybody dropping in, and have a great week. All right, bye.